April 15, 1961. Dawn breaks over the Caribbean, and the world doesn't know it's about to flirt with nuclear death. In a quiet airfield in Nicaragua, American pilots in unmarked uniforms load bombs onto aging B-26 bombers. Their insignias have been painted over, their flight plans erased. Officially, these men don't exist. But their orders come from the Central Intelligence Agency, and their mission is to destroy Fidel Castro's Air Force before sunrise. Washington's story is simple: a group of Cuban rebels will rise up, storm their homeland, and free it from communism. What the world will never be told is that the entire rebellion, the training, the weapons, the air support, has been built and financed by the United States government. The operation's name, the Bay of Pigs. To President Kennedy, it was sold as a surgical strike. No fingerprints, no headlines. He'd been in office less than 3 months and was told it would be an easy win. The plan was already in motion before he took power, a leftover from Eisenhower's term, packaged neatly by the CIA as a low-risk liberation. Kennedy approved it reluctantly, but with one critical rule: America's hand must remain invisible. But as the first bombers roared toward Cuba that morning, everything was already unraveling. The mission relied on precision and deception, and it had neither. The pilots were undertrained, their intelligence outdated. The CIA had promised that the Cuban Air Force would be wiped out in minutes. Instead, radar stations picked up the attack immediately. Cuban fighters scrambled. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire. Within hours, the disguise was blown. The wreckage of one bomber carried American-made ammunition. A supposed Cuban-rebelled plane had U.S. serial numbers burned into its wings. At the United Nations, Cuba's ambassador pounded the desk, accusing Washington of an unprovoked assault. The American delegate denied everything, his voice calm but cracking. In Moscow, Khrushchev was watching. He didn't believe a word. By nightfall, Soviet intelligence confirmed what Khrushchev already suspected: this was no rebellion. It was an American operation disguised as revolution. Inside the Kremlin, phones buzzed, maps unrolled. Soviet nuclear forces were ordered to increase readiness. It wasn't yet war, but it was close enough that every major city on Earth was now one wrong decision away from being erased. Meanwhile, in the Situation Room, Kennedy's advisors were panicking. The president had approved limited airstrikes but now realized the cover was blown. He refused to authorize further attacks, fearing global exposure. The CIA begged him to change his mind. Just one more wave, they pleaded. But Kennedy, terrified of triggering open war with the Soviets, said no. That one decision sealed the fate of the invasion. Without air superiority, the landing force, 1,400 Cuban exiles trained in secret camps, would be walking into a death trap. They were told they'd be greeted as liberators. Instead, Castro's forces were waiting for them. Before dawn on April 17, the men hit the beaches at Playa Girón. Their radio operator called out to the mothership offshore, "Beach secure, moving inland." It was a lie. Mortar shells rained down within minutes. Cuban tanks rolled forward. The promised air support never came. By noon, the water was red. The invaders were trapped between the sea and Castro's army. Ships offshore couldn't approach without air cover. The CIA handlers, listening from command posts in Miami, realized the entire mission was collapsing. Still, they told the White House everything is proceeding as planned. No one wanted to be the one to admit failure. But it wasn't just a failed invasion, it was a message to the world. The United States had launched an undeclared act of war. The Soviets now had justification to respond anywhere they wanted. The Cold War chessboard tilted toward chaos. In Washington, Kennedy sat silent in the Oval Office, staring at casualty reports. He'd trusted the experts, men with decades of experience in covert warfare, and they had fed him a fantasy. CIA Director Alan Dulles insisted that Castro's regime was ready to collapse. But in Havana, Castro was stronger than ever. The invasion had turned him into a national hero. Volunteers flooded recruitment offices. Soviet aid tripled overnight. As the last American-trained fighters were captured on the beach, one U.S. destroyer received orders to pull back. The president wouldn't risk direct intervention. To the men stranded on the sand, the message was clear: they'd been abandoned. Radio transmissions intercepted that day capture a chilling moment, one voice, hoarse and desperate, calling for air support that would never arrive. Then silence. Out of 1,400 invaders, more than 100 were killed. Over 1,000 were taken prisoner. Castro paraded them through Havana as proof that Cuba had beaten the United States. In Moscow, Soviet officials toasted with vodka, convinced America had humiliated itself. But behind the propaganda, something far more dangerous was brewing. Khrushchev concluded that Kennedy was weak, indecisive, unwilling to fight. He believed the young president could be pressured, even manipulated. That miscalculation would lead directly to the most dangerous confrontation in human history just a year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in April 1961, no one could see that far ahead. The world only saw a failed invasion and a humiliated superpower. The CIA, however, saw something different and an opportunity to try again. They began drafting new covert operations within days, convinced that next time, they'd get it right. They never learned. Inside the CIA's own walls, whispers spread. Analysts and field agents started realizing just how close the Bay of Pigs had come to sparking nuclear retaliation. Soviet submarines near Cuba had already been issued coded alerts. In Europe, American bases quietly raised their defense levels. If even one Soviet commander had misread the situation, if one radar technician had mistaken the airstrikes for a prelude to invasion, global war might have followed. But the CIA didn't see that as failure. They saw it as proof of American resolve. Reports were rewritten. Blame was shifted. The internal narrative painted Kennedy as hesitant, the reason the mission failed. Not the agency's arrogance, not the bad intelligence, not the fantasy of spontaneous uprising. Just one man's lack of commitment. The truth was simpler and darker. The CIA structure rewarded optimism and punished doubt. Analysts who raised concerns were sidelined. Field reports that contradicted the plan were ignored. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just a mistake, it was a system failure. A bureaucracy that valued success on paper more than reality on the ground. The same men who'd sold Kennedy the invasion would later run operations in Laos, Vietnam, and Angola, rewriting history each time they failed. To them, secrecy was victory. Accountability was the enemy. And on April 15, 1961, their secret almost ignited the end of the world. When the operation collapsed, the aftermath was brutal. Families of captured fighters begged Washington for answers. Kennedy, shaken and furious, fired Allen Dulles and his top deputies. Behind closed doors, he told his advisors, "I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind." But even that threat couldn't undo what had happened. America's credibility was shattered. The Soviets began deploying more missiles to Cuba, testing just how far they could push. Castro, paranoid but emboldened, tightened his grip on power. He executed suspected traitors, nationalized more industries, and invited Soviet military advisors onto the island. For the CIA, it was a nightmare of their own making. Every action they took to destroy communism in Cuba had only strengthened it. But there's another layer to this story, one rarely discussed. Declassified documents decades later revealed that several CIA officers privately feared that if the invasion failed, Castro would turn fully to Moscow for protection, forcing the Soviets to install nuclear weapons on the island. In other words, they predicted the Cuban Missile Crisis before it even happened, and still went ahead. It wasn't ignorance. It was hubris. Kennedy never forgave the intelligence community for misleading him, but he learned fast. During the missile crisis the following year, he refused to trust CIA projections at face value. He demanded photographs, human sources, and verification before acting. The world avoided annihilation by inches, a lesson paid for in blood on the beaches of the Bay of Pigs. But for every lesson learned, others were buried. The official reports minimized the CIA's role, sanitized the chaos, and omitted the near-nuclear alerts triggered across the Atlantic. The narrative became one of a tragic but necessary failure. Inside Langley, medals were still handed out quietly. Careers continued. Files were sealed. In public, the story was over. In secret, the machine kept running. The same blueprints that had doomed the Bay of Pigs were recycled in coups from Latin America to the Middle East. Each time, the pattern repeated: overconfidence, secrecy, denial, and another country left in ruins. April 15, 1961 wasn't just the day the CIA almost started World War III. It was the day America's shadow learned it could fail catastrophically and survive untouched. History books remember the Bay of Pigs as an embarrassment, a footnote in Kennedy's early presidency. But in the classified files, it reads differently, as a turning point. The day when covert power realized it could move nations without accountability. The day truth became optional. Every decision made that week, from the first bomb loaded onto a B-26 to the last desperate radio call on the beach, carved the blueprint for decades of covert warfare. Vietnam, Chile, Iran, Afghanistan, echoes of that same arrogance, that same belief that secrecy equals control. April 15, 1961, didn't start World War III. But it showed how close we could come when power hides behind silence. And that's the real terror of the story, not the bombs, not the lies, but how easily it could all happen again. The beaches of southern Cuba were silent now, a wasteland of burned landing craft and shattered rifles half buried in the sand. The sea still carried the smell of diesel, oil, and blood. Waves washed up bits of uniforms, splintered wood, and the occasional boot that no one came back for. For 48 hours the radios had screamed with broken transmissions, coordinates shouted through gunfire, desperate requests for ammunition, final goodbyes whispered into static. Then the voices vanished, one by one, leaving only the endless hiss of dead air. In Washington the silence felt heavier than smoke. Inside the White House, Kennedy's advisors moved like men leaving a funeral they weren't allowed to mention. In the Situation Room, the map of Cuba still glowed under fluorescent light. Red pins marked battalions that no longer existed. Someone had drawn excess over them in pencil, too ashamed to pull them out entirely. The president stood there for a long time, eyes fixed on a coastline that had swallowed a generation of illusions. His fingers tapped against the table, once for every promise that had died on that beach. The CIA called it an operational setback. Kennedy called it what it was, humiliation. But humiliation was only the surface. Beneath it ran panic, denial, and fear. Every department scrambled to rewrite history before it hardened into fact. Reports were shredded, names replaced with code names, memos rewritten until failure sounded like progress. Strategic reassessment, they called it. Limited success. Lies wrapped in euphemisms to protect reputations that no longer deserved saving. Across the ocean, Nikita Khrushchev examined reconnaissance photos from Cuban radar sites. He didn't see failure, he saw opportunity. The United States had blinked, and the world had noticed. Within weeks Soviet planners began drafting Operation Anida, the quiet deployment of nuclear missiles to Cuba. To Moscow it was deterrence. To history it would become the Cuban Missile Crisis. At Langley, shredders worked day and night. Analysts rewrote summaries to sound heroic. Even disasters were reframed as partial victories. One junior officer, Thomas Carson, refused to destroy his copy of the original brief. He read the first page again and again, "We will be welcomed as liberators." He underlined it until the paper tore. In his journal he wrote, "We didn't lose control. We never had it." By the end of April 1961 the story was being buried beneath press conferences and patriotic speeches. But inside the Pentagon and the Kremlin alike, a darker understanding was forming: when open war is impossible, deception becomes the only battlefield left. And in that new kind of war, fought in silence, hidden by words, truth would always be the first casualty. In the months after the Bay of Pigs, the world didn't calm down, it tightened. Every capital city felt it, like the planet itself was holding its breath. The American government buried the failure under layers of denial, but the aftershocks rippled through every corridor of power. Kennedy demanded answers. The CIA delivered excuses. Both sides walked away convinced of one thing: the next battle wouldn't be fought on beaches, but in shadows. Langley turned inward. Analysts drafted new doctrines with cold precision: plausible deniability, covert influence, psychological operations. Words that made deception sound professional. The Bay of Pigs wasn't seen as a mistake, it was seen as a test run. The agency's new motto became unspoken but absolute: next time, we win in silence. In the Oval Office, Kennedy was learning the price of power. He had inherited an operation plan before his presidency, trusted the so-called experts, and been handed a disaster. His public approval wavered, but privately, he hardened. By late 1961, he authorized Operation Mongoose, an even more aggressive covert campaign to sabotage Cuba. Assassination plots, propaganda drops, biological sabotage, fake news broadcasts, everything was fair game now. The United States had failed openly once, it wouldn't fail in the light again. Meanwhile, in Havana, Fidel Castro wasn't celebrating. Victory brought paranoia. He purged his inner circle, executed suspected traitors, and invited Soviet advisors to fortify his defenses. The revolution had survived, but he knew it painted a target on Cuba's back forever. Soviet ships began to arrive quietly in late 1961, carrying crates that no customs officer dared to open. In Moscow, Khrushchev analyzed every American move like a gambler reading an opponent's tell. He saw a young, shaken president desperate to prove control. And so, he decided to test him. If America wanted covert war, the Soviets would answer in kind, but louder, closer, and riskier. The Cold War was no longer cold, it was smoldering. At the CIA, field operatives were told to expand psychological operations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The logic was simple: if the enemy could not be fought directly, destabilize them from within. Elections were influenced, economies nudged toward collapse, leaders replaced under the banner of freedom. The same playbook would echo through decades: Vietnam, Chile, Iran, Afghanistan, all born from the lessons learned on those Cuban beaches. By the end of 1961, covert war had a pulse, a structure, and a budget. It no longer needed permission to exist. Every agent understood the new rule: success meant no headlines. Failure meant denial. The Bay of Pigs was no longer a disaster to be remembered, it was the foundation of a new world order, one built on silence, secrecy, and the illusion of control. By 1962, Operation Mongoose was in full swing. It wasn't a single mission, it was a machine with hundreds of moving parts, all designed to make Cuba bleed without firing a single American bullet. Propaganda teams forged anti-Castro pamphlets. Saboteurs planted explosives in Cuban sugar mills. Radio broadcasts spread rumors of Soviet betrayal. And in the deepest corners of Langley, men in suits discussed the unthinkable: how to make a leader vanish without leaving fingerprints. The CIA's imagination turned grotesque. Exploding cigars. Poisoned wetsuits. Tainted diving gear. Even hallucinogenic sprays meant to make Castro appear insane during public speeches. Each idea sounded absurd, but they were signed, funded, and tested. Nothing was off the table now. Every failure was hidden behind layers of deniability. Every report was written in the passive voice: it is believed, sources suggest, unknown actors attempted. The language itself became camouflage. No one in Washington wanted another Bay of Pigs, so every operation was built to disappear before it could be blamed. But in the Caribbean heat, paranoia spreads faster than disease. Cuban intelligence, trained by the KGB, began to dismantle American networks one by one. Agents vanished. Local informants were executed on live radio. Havana was becoming a mirror of Washington's own darkness, both sides obsessed with control, both terrified of exposure. Then came October 1962. U.S. spy planes snapped photos of Soviet missile sites being built on Cuban soil. The images were undeniable. Nuclear warheads, capable of hitting Washington, New York, and most of the eastern seaboard, were suddenly 90 miles away. The world teetered on a wire thinner than reason. Inside the White House, Kennedy's inner circle fractured. Some demanded invasion. Others warned that a single mistake could trigger the end of humanity. The Bay of Pigs haunted every discussion, a ghost whispering, "Don't trust the experts, don't trust the generals." The same men who promised quick victories now promised nuclear restraint. For 13 days, the planet froze. Submarines circled unseen. Missiles stood armed. Pilots waited for launch orders that never came. And in Havana, Castro prepared for death, convinced that if war began, Cuba would be erased first. The silence of those days was heavier than any bomb. When the crisis finally ended, when Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for US promises, the world exhaled. But no one walked away clean. Kennedy learned that victory in secret came at a moral cost no speech could wash away. The CIA learned that covert power worked best in the dark. And both sides learned the same terrifying truth: the closer you get to total control, the closer you stand to total destruction. After the missiles left Cuba, the world pretended peace had returned. Headlines praised diplomacy, politicians smiled for cameras, and Kennedy's approval ratings soared. But inside the agency, the tone was darker. To the men who had risked everything in silence, the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't a triumph, it was proof that the world could be pushed to the edge and still kept in the dark. The Bay of Pigs had been a lesson in humiliation. The Missile Crisis became a lesson in control. From that point forward, covert power didn't aim to topple governments in the open. It learned to shape them quietly, through money, influence, blackmail, and fear. The blueprint of modern intervention was being drawn, one lie at a time. In Southeast Asia, CIA front companies began supplying non-combat advisors to South Vietnam. The term was a euphemism. Many of these men were trained killers, mercenaries in civilian clothes. Their mission wasn't to fight, it was to destabilize. Create chaos, blame the other side, justify escalation. It was the same pattern, just a new stage. In Latin America, they armed rebels under the banner of freedom. In Africa, they funded dictators under the banner of stability. In Europe, they spied on allies under the banner of security. Every operation came wrapped in patriotic language, but the meaning was always the same: control the narrative, control the outcome. Documents from that era, once redacted, now declassified, reveal how institutionalized the deception became. Entire task forces were dedicated to perception management. Psychological warfare units designed pamphlets, fake newspapers, and forged diplomatic cables. It wasn't about winning wars anymore, it was about winning belief. The irony was brutal. The same government that feared Soviet propaganda was now mastering it. The same democracy that swore transparency had turned truth into a tool. Agents who questioned the ethics were sidelined, reassigned, or silenced. A new generation of spy masters emerged, men who believed that moral lines were just tactical inconveniences. By 1965, Kennedy was gone, Johnson was deep in Vietnam, and the agency's reach had stretched further than anyone imagined. Every embassy could be a front, every journalist could be an asset, every rumor could be a weapon. America's shadow war had no borders now. It was global. And yet, even as it grew, the same ghosts lingered. The failed invasion. The men lost on the beaches. The lesson that no one would admit: that power built on secrecy will always rot from within. The Bay of Pigs wasn't the end of an operation, it was the beginning of a mindset. One that would shape the next 50 years of history and leave a trail of truth buried under classified ink. By the late 1970s, the shadows had grown too wide to hide. Vietnam had torn the illusion apart. The Pentagon Papers exposed the lies. The Watergate scandal showed that corruption didn't just infect the foot soldiers, it reached the Oval Office. And when the Senate opened the Church Committee hearings, the world got its first real glimpse into what the CIA had become. What they found wasn't the clean world of spy novels. It was something colder. Files on assassinations, coups, blackmail operations. Experiments on civilians under the MKUltra program. Evidence that the agency had spied on American citizens, journalists, and senators alike. It wasn't about foreign threats anymore, it was about managing control at home. The revelations shocked the public, but not everyone inside Langley was surprised. To many veterans, it was inevitable. When you build an empire of secrecy, the enemy eventually becomes anyone who asks questions. The hearings ended with promises of reform, new oversight committees, and public accountability. But behind closed doors, very little changed. The structure was too valuable to dismantle. The machine simply learned to hide better. By the time the 1980s rolled in, the battlefield had shifted again, to Central America, the Middle East, and beyond. The faces changed, the missions evolved, but the fingerprints were the same. Proxy wars replaced invasions. Economic sanctions replaced bombs. Disinformation replaced armies. The blueprint drawn in Cuba was still being followed, just with new actors. And then came the digital age, the final evolution. Satellites replaced spies. Data replaced dossiers. Social media became the new battlefield. Where once it took teams of agents to forge a narrative, now an algorithm could do it in seconds. The machinery of deception no longer needed a human face. The legacy of the Bay of Pigs had gone viral. It's tempting to believe that history moved on, that lessons were learned, that the ghosts of failed invasions stayed buried in the archives. But history doesn't end. It just changes shape. Every drone strike, every covert deal, every leaked file carries echoes of that same arrogance, the belief that secrecy equals safety. April 1961 wasn't just a blunder. It was a warning. A glimpse into how fragile democracy becomes when truth is treated as expendable. Kennedy once said that victory has 1,000 fathers, but defeat is an orphan. The Bay of Pigs was that orphan, disowned, denied, forgotten. Yet it still lives in the DNA of every covert action since. Because the real legacy of that invasion isn't the battle, the loss, or even the politics. It's the idea that reality itself can be engineered if you control the story long enough. And as long as that belief survives, the line between freedom and manipulation will keep blurring, one secret at a time.